All right. And we'll have a blog post up with a link to the recording in the next couple of days. So on to our program, and welcome Nancy. Nancy Olmstead is a conservation ecologist at the Maine branch of the Nature Conservancy. Right now, she's assisting the Maine Natural Resource Conservation Program, a mitigation program that's administered by TNC to restore, enhance, and conserve wetlands and other protected aquatic habitats. She also assists TNC's Maine's land management team, helping to steward the Nature Conservancy's preserves in Maine through ecological monitoring, management of invasive species, use of prescribed fire, and other projects. She's worked as an educator and a field scientist and has a ton of relevant experience. So we are really grateful, Nancy, to have you here tonight to educate us a bit about biodiversity and the benefits. So I'm going to spotlight you and make all of us go away, and you're welcome to share your screen anytime.
All right, thanks, Caroline. Bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, and then I need to do this. And the magic should work here. Okay, and I need to do one more little step. Okay, Caroline, can you give me a nod if you're seeing the full screen view?
Yes, that looks perfect.
Terrific. Okay. Well, thank you again, Caroline, for inviting me to speak. I must admit, when the broad topic of biodiversity was the ask, I felt a little overwhelmed because there's a lot to say about biodiversity. So I came up with sort of two things that I want to be sure to give you as take-home messages. Number one, biodiversity is important. And number two, biodiversity is not the only thing that's important in conservation. So we'll unpack this a little more today. So this is just a beautiful slide of Maine. Beautiful view of our sort of extensive forest landscape. As I think you all probably know, we have more than 90% of the state in forests. So bear that in mind too as we learn about biodiversity. As Caroline said, I work for the Nature Conservancy in Maine. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And we do that with a variety of programs. So here in Maine, we have staff who work on oceans. We have staff who work on freshwater systems, and particularly in river restoration and other kinds of river work. We have staff who manage the approximately 300,000 acres of land that we own in Maine. And then we also own easement properties and steward those. And we have a team that works on climate. So we have a bunch of different staff. We're up to about 50 people working in Maine now. And it's a great place to work. And it's been a pleasure to be there now for about 2 years. So starting with a dictionary definition of biodiversity, I just went to merriam-webster.com, and they say that biodiversity is biological diversity in an environment as indicated by numbers of different species of plants and animals. And right away, we can tell that this definition is a little bit inadequate because we know that there's a lot more life on this planet than plants and animals. If you're looking at this sort of tree of life, you can see on the right-hand side that animals and fungi and plants are only a few branches of life. We've got a whole other series of, they call them domains now. I learned them as kingdoms, but we got a bacteria, we've got single-celled things. And so I just want to say that the dictionary definitions that you may read are sort of inadequate for thinking about biological diversity, biodiversity. Many of my microbiologist friends tell me that the species concept isn't even really that useful in many of these groups of organisms because they don't play by the same rules. So I think it's a useful concept. It's a basic idea. I'm going to use biodiversity to include all life, but we'll see that we're really kind of just scratching at the surface of kind of the microbiome. There's still a lot to learn about biodiversity in everything from like the slime molds leftward in this graph. We have a lot to learn, and probably like the bottom right-hand corner here with the flagellates, etc. I want to introduce the concepts of different scales or facets of biodiversity. So genetic diversity or variations within a species that are due to differences in DNA and genes is a very important component of biodiversity. And this genetic diversity is important because it strengthens the ability of species and populations to resist diseases, pests, changes due to climate, and other stressors. So in this photograph, you're seeing diversity in maize or corn. And we know that, there's a lot of genetic diversity in most species, many species. And that diversity is important to allow species to adapt and evolve over time in response to changes in their environment. And so that's kind of the underpinning of biological diversity is genetic diversity, but we don't often think about it unless we're dealing with like a very rare species, which has come down to a very tiny population size, where you can, start to get immediate concerns about inbreeding. But from a conservation perspective, I want to make the point that because we need to keep all the genetic diversity, as conservationists, we want to be concerned about species way before their populations get really small, because by that point, you've already lost a lot of the genetic diversity that, the species might need in order to adapt and respond to changes. So this is an important component, and it's one that's kind of invisible, to most of us as on a daily basis. Another facet or scale of biodiversity is in regards to rarity. So when we think about biodiversity, one of the things we think about is rare species. And I want to say that rarity is relative. And so as we learn about how different systems rank different species, it can be helpful to understand the differences. So I'll walk us through. On the left, we're looking at the New England cottontail. So this is a little rabbit species that is endemic to New England. It only occurs in this part of the world. So it's listed as G3, globally vulnerable, kind of at the whole world level. It is a state endangered species. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal agency that's in charge of the the Endangered Species Act, has evaluated it but decided not to list it under that act. So this is a species that is state endangered, and it's also rare globally. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you're looking at a photo of a beautiful bird. This is the black-crowned night heron. This is also a state endangered species in Maine, but this is a species that is globally secure, or G5. So although it's become endangered in Maine, the population globally is robust. So it's not that it's not important to keep it in Maine. I want to keep it in Maine selfishly because I think it's a really cool bird, and it's important to reflect on, what are the problems that are causing it to become less common in Maine. But the rarity is relative depending on your scale. Another facet or scale of biodiversity is something called functional diversity. This one's a little bit more complicated to understand, but you can think of it as sort of bench depth. So for example, bats. Bats are classified by biologists, or one of the ways that they are kind of grouped by species is feeding guilds. And so different kinds of bats feed in different ways. So this bat here appears to be munching on some fruit. So that's a frugivore, the third thing in the list there. There are also aerial insectivores, high-flying aerial insectivores that use a different part of the sky resource. There are nectarivores, nectar-eating bats, piscivores, fish-eating, sanguinivore, blood-eating, and gleaning animalivores. So they eat animals that are gleaned off of other animals, I think. So obviously not all in Maine. We don't have all those kinds of bats in Maine, but this is just an example of functional diversity. So there are different species of bats that are aerial insectivores. And if there are 3 or 5 of those, and one of them, if the population goes really low in a certain area, there are other bats that are also doing that. But if you only have one nectarivore bat species, and that one, the population drops really low in an area, then it might not be fulfilling a role in the system. So that's another component of biodiversity. And another example with this is pollinators. I wanted to use a different example because I'm going to talk about insects a lot, but so functional diversity is another aspect of diversity. And I think I'm going to pause here and just say, we forgot to say this in the beginning, but if you could hold your questions or put them in the chat when you come to you, and we're going to address them at the end, unless someone has a quick clarifying question, which Caroline can vet from the chat. But I do hope to have time for questions. Sorry, I forgot to say that at the beginning. There is a well-known pattern in biodiversity, which is called the latitudinal gradient. And what that is a general pattern that many species there are more of different kinds of species at the tropics. So, this holds for a lot of groups of organisms, plants and mammals and different kinds of organisms. This particular image is showing vertebrate species richness. And you can see that the red is higher species richness, and it does really show a pattern here of increasing species richness toward the equator and decreasing species richness as you get up toward the poles. And when I went to prepare this talk, I thought, oh yeah, I know the reasons for that. And I sort of started poking around, and it's a little bit more complicated than I first remembered. There are some hypotheses that are put out to explain this, and these are not mutually exclusive. And I should say that this is an area of active scientific inquiry and discussion. So there's a geographic area hypothesis, which just holds that there's more land area in these latitudes. But you can see on the map, there's a lot of land area up in the Northern Hemisphere too. So I'm not sure that one holds true for all ways of thinking about it. There is a climatic stability hypothesis, which posits that the tropics are less variable in their climate than other parts of the world. And so that might allow species to continue to persist and not be subject to extremes in climate. There is another hypothesis about lower extinction and higher speciation rates in the tropics that is related to the higher temperature there. Higher temperature speeds up all kinds of things in life, including metabolic rates, mutation rates in the genome. It speeds up generational time, so the time it takes for an organism to mature and have offspring. So there could be just some ways in which those kind of physiological processes are going faster in those regions and allowing for more speciation and lower extinction. So those are some of the hypotheses, and it's an interesting pattern. It doesn't hold true for every single group of organisms, but it does for many. So I'll just put that out there as a pattern that's well known in biodiversity. I'm going to zoom in a little to Maine and talk about factors influencing Maine biodiversity. So, this is a graphic. The colors here are showing different ecoregions. And the ecoregions pertain to different factors like geology, landforms, so topography. I think that's what that means with landforms, soils, climate, land use, hydrology, and I added ocean because there is a real marine influence along the coast in Maine. And I've added this red box to indicate the area where in Maine 3 different ecoregions come together. And no surprise, that is the part of Maine that is home to a lot of biodiversity. So we have species that are more southerly in their distribution, reaching a northern end of their distribution, and species which are more northerly, reaching the southern end of their distribution, right in the part of Maine where a lot of people live. So that's something important to note and think about. We have a lot of biodiversity. A lot of our rare species, I should say, are found in southern and sort of central, mid-coast and interior Maine. So we have a big list of species because it includes a lot of stuff that are also found further north or further east. But we also have more rare things. So a couple different ways to think about biodiversity. Okay. Just looking at my notes, I think I've said what I wanted to say. And I think, y'all can intuit this, but we have a big climate gradient in Maine from the north to the south. So that's part of what's driving these big differences in ecoregions. And then the influence of the ocean to keep things a little bit more temperate in the winter and cooler in the summer is also a factor that drives Maine biodiversity. So here's a table with some numbers of species richness, the absolute number of species known for different taxons or groups of species in Maine. And I'm just going to pause for a minute and let you look at this because it's a lot of information. And you'll see that I've highlighted the marine species in blue. So now that you've had just a few seconds to sort of digest this, I'm going to point out some trends or patterns here. So obviously, we got a lot of arthropods in Maine and generally in the world. So arthropods are, they are spiders, they are crustaceans like lobsters and crabs. So that includes a lot of very diverse groups. Caroline alluded in the introduction to the fact that insects are really one of the most diverse groups of, at least, you know, the sort of non-microscopic life that we know on Earth. I did say that we have a lot to learn from our microbiologist colleagues about the diversity of the microbiome, but we got a lot of insects and other arthropods. We have a lot of fungi, and that's only mushrooms. I couldn't find any numbers for slime molds or lichens. I mean, we probably have a number for lichens. I didn't dig hard enough. Vascular plants, pretty well represented. Fishes, very well represented. So fishes, the vertebrate, the bony fishes are the most diverse group of vertebrates. And then you'll see that the numbers decline quite a bit for birds, several different estimates of birds, depending on who you ask and what time of year you're talking about. Mollusks are pretty diverse in the freshwater. And then you come down to mammals, pretty low, right? Only 32 species of mammals. Oh, excuse me, that's marine mammals. Where are we? Where do we have mammals? Mammals, excluding the marine mammals, 58, still pretty low. And amphibians and reptiles, there are at least species-rich groups within this kind of organismal level, not microbiology groups. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about different kinds of biodiversity in Maine, and one area that I would just say I know less about is freshwater biodiversity. However, there's a great report that my organization did years ago. This was a 2008 report called Life in Maine's Lakes and Rivers, Our Diverse Aquatic Heritage. And it's got all kinds of fun things. We've got dragonflies, we've got some kind of a diatom, it's a little phytoplankton. We've got sturgeon, which is a rare fish that comes up our rivers to spawn. We got a frog, we got a cool turtle, we've got, I think this is a crayfish rather than a lobster. So lots of cool species. The take-home message from this report is that Maine is home to some of the healthiest and most resilient watersheds in the eastern US. So that's great. It doesn't necessarily mean that our watersheds are the most diverse, but it means that the species that are there have healthy and resilient habitats. So that's about what I want to say. The other thing I want to say about lakes and rivers and those kind of edge habitats is that edge habitats tend to be a little more diverse because you're capturing suites of species that, you know, are in the lake but might come to the edge of the lake for various reasons. So the edge spaces are also pretty diverse. I want to talk a little bit about marine diversity in the Gulf of Maine. So we think of the Gulf of Maine as this area which is more or less bounded by these shallow banks, George's Bank and Brown's Bank. And it's this body of water where the Labrador Current comes down from sort of the northeast and adds cold rich water, and the shallowness of these banks and some of the areas of the Gulf allow for sunlight to penetrate, and you got a really rich area. When I asked Jeff Smith, our Oceans Program Director, about the Gulf of Maine biodiversity, he said, the Gulf of Maine is not particularly biodiverse, but it is highly productive. And so you see this picture here on the right of the, this is an example of the productivity of the Gulf of Maine. And of course, we don't just mean that in terms of fisheries, but that's a very obvious example. we have an abundance of life, abundance of biomass that grows in the Gulf of Maine, even though it's not particularly biodiverse naturally. Many seasonal visiting species take advantage of this productivity. So whales come here to feed, Atlantic bluefin tuna, the alewives that come seasonally and migrate up the rivers, the sturgeon, that prehistoric fish that I showed in the previous slide, and the American eel are just some examples of species that take advantage of the productivity of the Gulf of Maine. So that was the take-home message from our oceans lead, that even though the Gulf of Maine is not particularly biodiverse, it's very productive. And so there's an example of how biodiversity is important, but it's not the only thing that's important when we think about conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. Okay. I want to place Maine biodiversity in context. So these graphs or figures are from a publication called Biodiversity in Focus from a group called Nature Served. And this first one on the left shows the number of species of plants, with dark green being more plants and the lighter colors being fewer plants. So you see here that Maine has really just a modest amount of plants compared to some other places in the country. There's some hot spots of biodiversity in California, Texas, and the Southeast. On the right panel, you're seeing the percent of plants that are at risk. So these could be, rare species or imperiled species. And again, we see Maine is low in terms of percent of the plant species that are at risk, compared to places like California, the sort of Four Corners states, the desert, high desert, Texas, and then the Southeast has higher percent of plants at risk. So just a little context, let me go to animals. So similarly, the number of species of animals in Maine is not super duper high. You're seeing on the left that we have richer mammal groups in California, Texas, and the Southeast. But also, we don't have a lot of at-risk mammal species here. So this is kind of a little context, because I think sometimes that's helpful. It's hard to understand the numbers without some context. So, okay, so moving on to the theme of why is biodiversity important? So the first thing that came to me, and so I'm going to be just very vulnerable and share it with you, is that many people, including me, think that different species have sort of an intrinsic right to exist. So this is baked into a lot of sort of different spiritualities and different ways of thinking about the world. And I think, many folks just feel that different species have an intrinsic right to exist. They've evolved, they've gone through all these processes over millennia and hundreds of thousands of years, and that this is just part of what makes our world special. Another way to think about this is a very practical one. They provide what's called ecosystem services, also known as nature's benefits. So a diversity of species provides food, they provide pollination, as Caroline mentioned, with the native bees, as well as honeybees and other insects also pollinate. Water purification in our wetlands and other aquatic systems. Wood and fiber, medicine, it's a big one. They provide climate mitigation, so they buffer us and they absorb carbon. And they're good for mental health. We're learning more and more about the benefits of spending time in nature. And so I think there are many benefits that we get from nature. So sort of in a utilitarian way, these are good for us in many ways. And then another thing to consider is that biodiversity provides a source of resilience. And so I sort of touched on this when I talked about genetic resilience, that within it, genetic resilience is kind of within a species. Then there was the concept of functional diversity. So within, groups of species that perform different roles in an ecosystem, having numerous species that do a particular kind of thing can be a source of resilience in the face of change or population decline. So I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide, but I'm going to touch on some of these in a bit more detail. So in the vein of biodiversity being a source of resilience, here's an example of resilience in the face of a non-Indigenous pest. So what you're looking at in these photos, the photo on the left shows a lot of dead and dying trees, conifer trees. These are eastern hemlock trees. This is a photograph from North Carolina. And then on the right, you're seeing some standing dead eastern hemlock trees. I believe that photo is from New York, but I'd have to check that. So we have a non-Indigenous pest, the hemlock woolly adelgid. I'm sure many of you have heard of this pest, and it causes, as far as we know, almost total mortality in eastern hemlock. We're hoping to find some resistance, but having other trees that could fill the role that hemlock fills would be a way to have resilience. Having genetic diversity that would provide resistance would be another kind of form of resilience. So we know that there are many threats from non-Indigenous pests, and so keeping biodiversity both at the genetic level and also at the community level, communities of species, is important. Hemlock does a lot of work in our ecosystem. It provides really cool habitat for wildlife. It provides shade for brook trout streams and other cold water streams. And they're just really cool habitats. Hemlock forests in Maine tend to be sort of dense hemlock with a pretty open understory. And so they're very appealing to our human senses because we can see for a long distance through them. So they're beautiful places. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is that some species are keystone species. And I'll say more about the precautionary principle in a second, but a keystone species is just one that has a disproportionate impact on its environment. So you're seeing in these photographs evidence of beaver, American beaver, so a dam on the left here, and a beaver hard at work on this tree on the snow. And so beavers change systems and create all kinds of cool habitats. And it's been shown that there are numerous different sort of species that have disproportionate impacts in their environments and on other species. A beaver is just one example. We know what some of these are for like mammals, some marine intertidal systems. We know that mangroves are sort of a keystone species, corals and coral reefs, but we really I don't think we know very well about what are the keystone what are the keystone species for like insects, mushrooms, lichens. I mean, I don't think we have any idea. So the precautionary principle would posit that we gotta not let go, not throw away any of these pieces if we don't know how they're connected and what they do. So that's kind of a way to think about why keeping all the species is important, even if we don't fully understand all of their roles. Some of them may be really important and we just haven't figured it out yet. I'm thinking right now of like the gut biome research, and I know diversity is important there, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some keystone species. So just another possible example. I'm putting this image of the Bicknell's thrush in. It's a montage. That's why it looks a little weird. But one of this is under the category of like intrinsic right to exist. I love this bird. This bird is a high mountain breeding little songbird. It's about the size of a robin, and it has a beautiful sort of raspy flute-like song that it sings way up on the mountaintops. So I'm part of a citizen science or community science program that monitors forest montane birds. And these little songbirds migrate all the way to Cuba and Haiti and the Dominican Republic and back. And they nest up in the krumholtz, the very stunted balsam fir and spruce on the top of mountains in Maine and out across the northern Appalachians. So they're highly evolved to be able to withstand those mountain habitats where there's still snow in June and it's cold and windy. And this is a species that was just listed on Maine's Endangered Species Act as threatened, along with another high elevation breeder, the blackpoll warbler. Those high elevation habitats are really at risk from climate change. And so this is just an example of a really cool species. I think birds are cool, and I think they're important, probably in ways that we don't even know, but I just think that there's an intrinsic value there. It's a cool bird. And it's beautiful. Look at the beautiful speckled breast. Okay, I'm gonna pause and just take a sip of my water. So here's another beautiful forest, mountainous kind of Maine landscape scene. And there's a lot of carbon stored and being actively captured in forests like this. So even though some of our spruce fir or broad stretches of northern hardwood forests may not be that biodiverse, they're still important because of that value and because of other values that they provide. I mentioned, you know, cool, intact forests being important for cooling streams for the fishes and other freshwater aquatic life that like to live there. You may be familiar with the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative, which is trying to protect forest land around Sebago Lake, which is the drinking water source for the, like, I forget what large percent of Maine people, because it's the drinking water source for the greater Portland area, drinking it right now. So protecting forest helps to protect the watershed of Sebago Lake, which in turn protects our clean water. So there's a lot of values in these ecosystems from a human kind of utilitarian perspective. And in a common environment like this, we are able to maintain functional diversity by having these large stretches of forest. So like pollinators that work in the forest, forest birds, there's value in conserving large chunks of these systems for those species that live there. Another example of this is a salt marsh. Salt marshes, again, capture and store a lot of carbon. Some wetlands may store more than forests when you start to consider the below ground soil or peat accumulation. And these are naturally less diverse. There might only be 20 species of grass-like plants here, and the bulk of what you're looking at now is like 2 or 3 species in this photo. But they provide a specialized habitat for a lot of species, including some rare plants, some marine species that come in and use the salt marsh at various stages. And we have some rare birds that nest in the salt marsh habitat as well. Provides natural benefits like slowing and absorbing floodwater and buffering storm surge. So again, even though we think of salt marsh is a rare community in Maine. So it might get sort of put onto our biodiversity, you know, hot list. It's not a particularly like diverse system in and of itself, but it's still important for the functions and values and because it supports some species that are rare. So in terms of like, how is the biodiversity in Maine doing? I'm breaking it up because different entities have jurisdiction over different things. So the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and the Maine Endangered Species Act deal with animals, inland animals, so not marine animals. There are a total of 57 endangered and threatened species, 3 of which are also listed federally. So the federal species are the piping plover, the northern long-eared bat, and the roseate tern. And this was just added to this really recently, last month. This was a bill in the last, for the session of, I can't keep track, the legislative session that was closed earlier this year. And 5 birds, 1 bat, 1 bee, and 1 beetle were added. And, you know, birds are at risk due to climate change, coastal birds, montane birds. Plus, you know, we have human impacts on bird habitats. Birds that eat flying insects are at risk. There are several of those that were added to the list before. And these 5 birds, I mentioned that the thick-nosed thrush and the black-polled warbler were added. Those are high elevation birds. Bats, we have several bats on the list. Bats are in decline, precipitous decline because of white nose syndrome, which is a fungal pathogen. So that's about animals. I did not have much success in a quick search for trying to get the numbers for marine mammals and sea turtles, but many of them are at risk. I'm sure you've heard of some examples that are critically endangered, like the North Atlantic right whale, which is the one that's down to like 300 individuals or so, and is the source of all the consternation with the lobster fishery right now. But these are species that are under federal jurisdiction through the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. I have a note here. Yeah, so I have another note that says that birds that eat flying insects have declined by greater than 95% over the past 50 years due to the loss of habitat and declining insect populations. So there are some species that were already listed that are aerial insectivores. That's another common threat to the birds that are on this list. when we start thinking about plants, the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry's Maine Natural Areas Program and our sort of sister federal agency keep track of this. So there's 352 rare plants tracked in Maine. That does include 66 that are already potentially extirpated or, you know, gone from Maine. And 3 plants are also listed federally. So, you know, it was about 2,100 plants, to have, you know, 350 be rare is not an insignificant amount. And I don't know if the 2,100 included the extirpated species, but it's a detail. The federally listed plants in Maine are the Furbish's lousewort, which is that little tiny thing that grows up with the upper St. John River that Kate Furbish discovered. As a European discovered, and native people probably knew about it, but small world pogonia, which is a small wildflower that grows in parts of southern Maine. And there's one population of the northern white fringed orchis in Maine. All right, so thinking about plant communities, the Natural Areas Program has sort of evaluated 104 natural communities or plant communities in Maine. And you can see that 15 of them are critically imperiled, 22 are imperiled, 21 are vulnerable. So those are the ones that are considered rare or highly rare. And 46 are apparently secure or secure. And these are not regulated. The rare ones are tracked so that ecologists do map them and provide information about them to landowners. So I wanted to say that some of our globally rare natural communities, so we have some rare plant communities that are globally rare. Several of them are fire adapted communities like pitch pine systems. We have pitch pine barrens, we have pitch pine sand dunes in Maine. We have and then we have some river shore systems that are globally rare, like up on the upper St. John, where ice scour plays an important role in keeping the shoreline of the river open. Anyone who's tried to get down to a river knows that you're pushing your way through the willows and the alders, and it's a dense environment in many cases, but the upper St. John is a very low gradient slope, and the ice scouring every year refreshes those banks and makes it harder for shrubby things to get in there. And so there's a diverse herbaceous plant community, including some rare species. So there are some of our rare plant communities up there. That's just a little snapshot of the status. It's hard to sum it all up, but to give you a little flavor. If you want to learn more about this in particular, the website of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has a nice set of pages regarding the state list of endangered and threatened animals and freshwater fishes, which will tell you, you can find the list, you can find those species that were recently added, etc. And then if you want to learn more about the rare plants or rare natural communities, the website of the Maine Natural Areas Program within the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry similarly has a nice website. It has fact sheets for each of the different types of plant communities and each of the different rare plants. So it's like a page that has photos, and some of them have line drawings and stuff, so you can learn more about the different species. Okay, I'm going to take another sip of my water. 1:43. Okay, I want to make sure to leave time for questions, so I might go a little faster here. So a study condensed a lot of information and found that 34% of plant species in the US are at risk of extinction. 40% of animal species, with the focus on some freshwater things like amphibians, snails, mussels, crayfish. 41% of ecosystems are at risk of range-wise collapse, including a lot of grasslands. So that's sort of the big picture. Even bigger picture, globally, a different report found that pollution, climate change, land and sea use change, like conversion of forest for agriculture or something like that, overexploitation for human consumption in many cases, and invasive species. So those 5 things are the top 5 threats to global biodiversity. Threats to biodiversity here in the US, broken down a little bit more. For plants, you can see that invasive species and disease, this blue bar, 62% of imperiled plants are threatened by invasive species and disease. 40% of imperiled plants are threatened by agriculture. 38% of imperiled plants are threatened by recreation. And of course, these add to more than 100 because a plant can be threatened by multiple stresses. So you can see the patterns for terrestrial animals. Invasive species are also important. Agriculture, climate change. For freshwater animals, the sources are a little different. The causes are pollution, dams, and then invasive species. So, you know, when you break it out by different groups of species, the threats are a little different. There was this New York Times Magazine article in 2018 that some of you may have read. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? This was a great story. If you haven't read it, I recommend looking it up. It was based on a pretty terrifying 2017 scientific paper from a 30-year comparison study in Germany, where they compared the biomass of insects 30 years ago to present day, and they found a huge decline. And as we know, insects are food for a lot of things. And so there are some pretty important ramifications of this decline in abundance for our food webs, and we're losing our genetic diversity. Not to mention, you know, different species that we may be losing in these abundance declines. So this raised a lot of concern. Similarly, last year, the State of the World's Birds report was published by BirdLife International and found that 1 in 8 bird species is threatened with extinction. And similarly, we have a bird abundance decline. So more than 3 billion birds have been lost across North America and the European Union in the last half century. That's like individuals. So we just have seen a precipitous decline in the number of individuals. And the report breaks it down by different groups. You know, grassland birds fell more, arid lands birds fell more, and then lower in forest birds like this magnolia warbler. And again, you know, these declines in abundance are likely also reflecting declines in genetic diversity. So what can we do to help? I like to think of this as sort of our time, our talent, our treasure, our influence, and our personal choices. So you can support your local land trust and other conservation organizations who are working on these problems at, you know, different scales. You can participate in community science programs to help gather data on different groups. In Maine, we've got the Heron Project, which keeps track of wading bird nesting habitats like great blue heron areas. Mountain Bird Watch is a great program. I volunteer there. Signs of the Seasons is a phenology program that tracks the way that things are blooming and shifting in their fruiting patterns over time. I think it's mostly plants, but there may be insects too. You can help remove and manage invasive species. There's the Chickadee Checkoff. You can check the box to donate some money to the non-game and endangered wildlife work at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. You can consider and reduce your carbon footprint. You can reduce pesticide use. You can vote and write to your elected officials. You can write letters to the editor or op-eds. And I would also add supporting diverse voices in conservation. I think is really important for us to consider, you know, that when I came to go into this field, you know, I certainly didn't feel that I couldn't see myself in this field. We want everyone to be able to look into the world of conservation and see themselves and understand how they can make a difference, because nature is for everyone. And frankly, if people from diverse backgrounds don't feel that the conservation movement represents them, then we're not going to reach our goals of conserving the land and water on which all life depends. So I think that's an important thing to think about in addition to all of the more practical things here. If you look online, you can find all kinds of cute little things. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology has this neat website about 7 simple actions to help birds. You may be able to tell I like birds. I like plants too, but birds are really cool. So, you know, make your windows safer, keep your cats indoors, use native plants, avoid pesticides, drink shade-grown coffee. There's a really great bird-friendly shade-grown coffee roaster right in Topsham. You may know about it. Talk to me later if you don't. Reduce plastic use, do citizen science. And they go into more detail on all of these on the website. So that's one place to look. I have some recommended reading in case you're really like, oh boy, I need to know more about this. This report, Biodiversity in Focus, United States edition from NatureServe just this year. I drew some graphics from here, and I think it's a nice condensed report. So again, Biodiversity in Focus. Another report that I perused was Biodiversity in Crisis. This one is from Defenders of Wildlife. And again, it looks at both some big picture things globally and also some specific threats here in the United States. So this one is called Biodiversity in Crisis. And this one is also from this year. I've got references, which I won't go into, and I've got all my photo credits. And I want to say thank you for coming. Thank you for your time and your interest in this topic. And I want to leave again with my take-home messages that biodiversity is important, but biodiversity is not the only important thing in conservation. So I think we have time for a few questions. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a great and speedy overview of a huge topic. So I would invite people, you're welcome to either unmute yourself and ask a question or put a question in the chat. I will try to pull together those resources that Nancy mentioned and send them out in the next couple of days to everybody who's registered. One question I had, Nancy, was, do you know what, I mean, we all know that we lost the chestnut tree back in whenever it was, I don't know, late 19th century, or that was when it started. What was the primary tree that filled its ecological niche, or was it sort of a host? I mean, was it oaks or was it a bunch of trees? Do you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would be guessing. I certainly think oaks probably played a role. Chestnut sort of reaches the northern extent of where it was probably abundant here in Maine. So it would have been a species with affinity with, yeah, the red oak, the white oak, the American beech. That's a great question, Caroline. I don't know if we have data, but it reminds me that one of the issues that we deal with in education and talking to the next generation about issues of biodiversity is the shifting baseline. And I was a laboratory instructor at Bowdoin, and at one point I asked them, how many of you could recognize an American chestnut? And of course, they couldn't. And it's not their fault. They're not around. So we don't miss it if we don't know that it was there, right? But certainly there would have been a whole host of insect species that were associated with the American chestnut that for sure we've lost, and probably fungi too.
Yeah. And I just want to emphasize, I love your list of what we can do to help, because the information you gave about declines is a little discouraging, but I know for myself and for a lot of people that I know that taking action it feels really good, and it's a great counter to the sense of dismay that or more than dismay that we feel as we think about all of the challenges. So I really encourage, citizen science it's really fun, and it gets you out sort of looking at things closely, and everything from the smallest things you can do to reduce your carbon footprint, and you find one thing and then you start to build on it. So I would encourage people to think about that. Does anyone have a question? Anyone who wants to oh, Lucy? Did I see you raise your hand? Go for it.
Oh, thanks. And thanks, Nancy. That was amazing. It was so good and interesting. And I hope there's going to be a recording so I can send it to everyone I know. But my question is, what are there some really important questions that pop out that you think that need to be asked here in Maine? Some puzzles, something that you really want to know the answer to that you think will help. I don't know whether that's help with the public awareness or help with legislatively or in conservation.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Lucy. I will think about that. What some of the things that come to me from that question have to do with sort of the sense that a lot of our challenges in biodiversity and challenges with climate change, we sort of know what we need to do. it's a question of kind of figuring out how do we get over that basic human nature thing of discounting the future, right? So it's hard to tell yourself, oh, I'm not going to fly this year because I'm concerned about climate change, when everyone around you is traveling to all these places. It's a tricky nut to crack. It's really about human behavior. And so I think there is good work. So I know that there is the good news is there's great work being done here. So the field of behavioral psychology is alive and well, and people are crafting messaging that is helpful and is encouraging people to make different choices and advocate. So I think there probably is still learning there to, how do we, I think, for better or worse, it seems like the younger generation, because I think they've grown up with, unfortunately, these very disturbing facts and figures, and seeing the heavy weather events and other crises around the world. I think they get it. I think it's sometimes a little harder for folks in my generation and older to make changes. So I think that's something that comes to mind with your question, but I'll also keep that in mind in terms of other kinds of, more sort of pure ecological questions, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Roberta is asking, can you speak more about our shifting baseline through time? She says, while walking in my neighborhood, I often try to imagine what it was like here 50 years ago. And maybe you could explain the shifting baseline concept, because
Sure.
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, and I may not have explained it crystal clear. Right, so the idea is that 100 years ago, any good naturalist would have been able to identify, an American chestnut, an American elm, a passenger pigeon, the list goes on of different species that we've lost from our landscape. I mean, thankfully in Maine, there's not tons and tons of them, but nevertheless, healthy American beech, for example, American beech is a tree that occurs very diseased and sad looking in our forests now because of beech bark disease. So as people are trained as naturalists or ecologists, it's easy for them to think that the conditions today are normal. And in fact, the conditions today are minus X number of species and minus a gazillion amount of biomass in the forest, minus all the nuts from the American chestnut, minus all the nuts from the American beech. But we can't see that negative, right? So we don't know that it's there. And it, thankfully, it's not that nature isn't resilient, right? I mean, there are other animals and plants growing in those places, but we probably lost specialized species that, I feel have an intrinsic right to exist without human extinction, human-caused extinction. And there could be, and there probably are other ripple effects from the loss of the food source, the loss of the cavity trees. And another way someone described the shifting baseline to me is if you imagine a picture of fishermen 100 years ago with a giant, huge cod, because they were massive, right? Cod was a massive fish. And then like the prize cod now is like this, but that's the prize cod now. And the person who caught that cod is happy. The smile is the same, but the fish is different, right? So
another way, I think it was, I'm trying to remember who it was that it was in a program we had about fisheries, and maybe it was John Lichter who said, he described it also as the impact it has on scientists, because as each new generation of scientists comes forward, in the 1800s and 1700s, there were vast quantities of fish.
right.
As the fish stocks have declined, every new generation of scientists, they're born in, and their baseline is what's there when they're
Right.
young, or whatever
Right.
they've seen it. And so
Right.
research is sort of thinking in terms of what their personal starting point is, not thinking back to the 1700s when there were so many more,
Right.
which was a really interesting Really interesting idea. Oh, here's another question. What are your thoughts on managing a small woodlot for umbrella species?
Yeah, so my understanding of umbrella species, the idea is that if you conserve the umbrella species, you'll sort of sweep in a lot of things that are under the umbrella, because the umbrella species kind of are a stand-in for lots of other species that go with the same habitat. My thoughts on managing a small woodlot are that you want to take a long view and think about how to, particularly in southern Maine, how to leave the forest in a, in a state that will advance the structural complexity of the forest. Many of our forests only have maybe a couple of ages of trees in them because of our prior history. And so allowing trees of all different ages to be present and different sizes. Something that I've heard of some, if you're talking about managing with active sort of forest management, I think some things to consider include, trying to leave some woody material on the forest floor. It's really important for amphibians and reptiles and fungi and other forms of life. It creates habitat for small mammals and is part of the structural diversity of the system. Another thing are kind of large dying or dead trees that provide that those canopy, those cavities, the cavities for cavity nesting birds and animals. So those are a few thoughts. I think that there are organizations such as the Maine woodland owners that have some good information, and if you have a thoughtful forester advising you, I think that can also really help if that person knows that one of your main objectives is really for wildlife and other kinds of diversity.
Yeah, I think that at some point we want to try to do either a workshop or something about small woodlot management, because there is, a lot of the southern Maine woodlands are strikingly similar in
a
lot of, even age,
right.
size trees, and
Yep.
it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't cut in them. There are ways you can manage them to create the kind of structural diversity that Nancy's talking about. Roberta adds that the Wild Seed Project has a lot of information on restoration. They have some great resources. So it's a little after 8, and I want to let Nancy get back to her evening after so generously sharing her time with us. Any other burning questions that anyone has? Last chance. Oh, Michelle?
Yeah. I noticed recreation was one of the impacts, and I just wondered, I would guess most of us here tonight enjoy getting outdoors. Any quick recommendations of how we lessen our impact?
Yeah, I think that, following the posted rules of the preserve that you're visiting is important. Trying to, if there are sensitive habitats, being respectful of those. So, for example, staying off of salt marshes during bird nesting season, or not allowing dogs to be trampling through vernal pools during the amphibian breeding period, those kinds of things. I should review my slides to see what the context was for the recreation. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think that must have been recreation was a threat to plant species. Oh, so another thing so again, like just staying on trail. So for example, in alpine zones where there can be rare plants, there are usually signs that say, this is a tough place to grow, please stay on the trail. And that's why, because some of the plants are subject to trampling. I think also that there are threats, bigger threats from off-road vehicles that probably are included in that recreation graph. So I think if you use ATVs or other off-road vehicles, you also just want to stay on trails and just be very respectful that you're not creating new trails where trails don't exist. So it was, I looked at that graph, I can share it real quick. It was, let me just share my screen and so that others can see it too. It was a particular, and I apologize, you're just going to see my whole slideshow here, but the recreation, this orange bar, is a threat to plants. And so again, I think specifically like trampling, harvesting could be thought of as recreation. So if people are going out and collecting orchids, you shouldn't collect orchids. Please don't dig up orchids. Those are some of the things that I bet they mean by recreation. So I think walking in the woods, if you're staying on the trail, I don't think that has high impacts and you shouldn't be concerned about that. I think for many rare plant species, the threats are, you know, they are from off-trail use or collecting or heavier use like off-road vehicles. Or yeah, I'm going to stop there. Does that, Michelle, does that feel right? Did I answer your question?
That pretty much hit it. One thing I think people need to be aware of, and I don't think enough people are, is the impact of dogs.
Yeah.
They really impact. And we used to do vernal pool studies, and noise, dogs, things like that, everything would go quiet, and it would take a long time before they would start being vocal again.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there are places where, you know, they have designated dog areas and including some off-leash areas, but it's important for preserves that are signed for no dogs or no dogs in certain seasons to respect those closures. I know that one of our rare bird species, the piping plover that nests on beaches, there have been some direct impacts of dogs, unfortunately. And it's, you know, there are many wonderful dog owners, and then there are some dog owners that don't follow the rules. So we know that most people follow the rules, but yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. I just want to share in the chat, Janet is recommending the book North Woods by Daniel Mason, which is supposedly, according to the New York Times, one of the best 10 books of the year. It's a 300-year view from a house in Massachusetts. So anyway, thank you so much, Nancy. And thanks everybody for showing up. And I'll send out some of the resources that Nancy shared in an email sometime in the next couple of days or so. We'll see. Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.